Good afternoon. I am Joy Murphy, Director of Learning and Engagement for the Eisenhower Presidential Library. I want to welcome you to our monthly Lunch and Learn program. This year, our programming theme is Waging Peace. In this series, we are looking at some of the ways that President Eisenhower sought global peace. This month is focused on Eisenhower's use of moral persuasion. Today, we are pleased to welcome Dr. Mark Bucknam, a professor at the National War College in Washington, D.C., who will talk to us about the Suez Canal crisis. Before I hand it over to Dr. Buckman, please note that there are pads and pencils on the tables for you to jot down questions that you want Dr. Buckman to answer at the end. Those of you live streaming this event will be able to submit questions via the chat function at the end of the program. With that, please welcome Dr. Buckman.
I want to thank Joy Murphy and also Samantha Pryor there at the library for all they've done to set this up and for inviting me today. And I want to make a special shout out to John Anderson at KABI, the General 560 AM radio, for a terrific interview he did the other day. And it was terrific, not because he was interviewing me for sure, but because he had really done his homework and I think helped his audience understand the importance of what we're going to talk about today, which is Eisenhower, the Suez Crisis, and lessons for today. So if we could go to the next slide, please. I want to start out by highlighting the fact that where I work today at the National War College and on Fort McNair, the home of the National Defense University, we've got a long and deep connections to President Eisenhower. That handsome building you see in the upper left is Roosevelt Hall. That's where I'm sitting speaking to you from. And it was built it started in 1903. President Theodore Roosevelt laid the cornerstone, and it was to become the Army War College. Major, I believe, went when he attended the Army War College in the class of 1928. So he'd be well familiar with the building I'm speaking to you from and from this and with this campus. At the right, you see a newer building, and that is Eisenhower Hall, named for the president. And it began once upon a time, not here on Fort McNair, but I believe it was in the area somewhere. But it started out as the Army Industrial College. And President Eisenhower attended the Army Industrial College, graduating in 1933. And then staying around on faculty for a year or two. So again, he would feel right at home here on Fort McNair and at the National Defense University where I work. A couple other items that connect us with the president. You see down at the lower left, you see a picture of a book it calls Solarium at 70. And you probably can't read it, but the subtitle is Project Solarium's Influence on Eisenhower Historiography and National Security Strategy. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute, but it's a recent publication. It just came out in December, and it's part of one of the monographs that the NDU Press, National Defense University Press, puts out. And it looks at how our understanding of Project Solarium impacted our understanding of President Eisenhower and his role in history. Now, for those who might not remember, Project Solarium was one of the first things that President Eisenhower kicked off when he became president. When he took office, within 2 months, in March of 1953, he initiated this Solarium project, named for the room allegedly where he and John Foster Dulles decided to undertake it, the Solarium room at the White House. Project Solarium was actually conducted here at National War College. It wasn't National War College back then, but here in Roosevelt Hall. And they did it on a summer break, and they did it in secret. And what it was President Eisenhower commissioned 3 teams to look at different ways of doing containment and dealing with the Soviets in the Cold War. And Team A was headed by the famous George Kennan, who was the first deputy commandant here at the National War College back in 1946. And he's the famous diplomat who wrote the long telegram from Moscow and later the X article in Foreign Affairs that talked about the sources of Soviet conduct and really started the whole idea of containment as a policy and strategy for dealing with the Soviet Union. So Kennan headed Team A, and they were going to look at continuing the Truman policies of containment. Team B was going to look at a stricter type of containment, if you will, where we draw a line in the sand and tell the Soviets don't cross that. So in other words, we weren't going to try to push them back, but we were going to try to keep the Soviets from advancing around the world. And then Team C was to look at rollback. That was the term, right? And there had been some campaigning done on this idea that actually we're unsatisfied with the Soviet sphere of influence in Eastern Europe and around the world, and we want to try to roll back their influence. So this was all undertaken in secret during the summer when the students were away from the National War College, and it was briefed out to President Eisenhower in July of 1953. And after hearing all the presentations, reportedly, the president stood up and for about 40 minutes held forth, giving a summary of all the main points that had been made and then explaining the way forward. And that was eventually captured in the document you see at the bottom left there. That's NSC 162/2, or National Security Council Document 162/2. The title of that is our National Security Policy, and it really set the tone for the rest of the Cold War, right down to the end. And what it did was it put a higher dependence on nuclear weapons for our security. But it also took a very holistic look at security. Eisenhower realized that it wouldn't do any good to buy security in terms of weapons if that meant bankrupting the country, or if it meant changing who we were as a democratic republic. And so it's a document that we still use. I'll use it next year. In the first course that our students get next year, they'll read that document as an example of strategy done right. So again, that's just to highlight the connections that we have with President Eisenhower here at Fort McNair and the National Defense University, and in particular, the National War College. If we could go to the next slide, please. All right, I mentioned this little publication on the left, Solarium at 70. It's a slim little volume and just came out. And what the thesis of the publication is that when the documents describing Solarium were finally declassified in the 1980s, it completely changed the history of the Eisenhower presidency. The early histories of the Eisenhower presidency were really quite flawed. And you see some examples there. These are just quotes from that Solarium at 70 volume. And there are many others like it, or several others like it, I should say. But for instance, the Columbia professor Richard Neustadt, in a book, it was noted, was extremely critical of Eisenhower's approach. And he described he said Eisenhower imparted a superficial symmetry and order, and his excessively formalized system caused him typically to become the last man in his office to know tangible details and the last to come to grips with acts of choice, et cetera, referring to him as being left helpless by this national security strategy system that he had set up at the White House. Nothing could be further from the truth, right? We know that now. Another example, Herman Feiner's Dulles over Suez. Notice he's giving all the attention to President Eisenhower's Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, because that was sort of the myth that grew up after the Eisenhower presidency, after President Eisenhower left the White House, was that really the foreign policy was being run by Dulles. Again, we'll see today that that was not at all the case. But that's the sort of thing that was being published in the early 1960s. Since Solarium has come out, there have been a number of volumes, and we'll take a look at a couple of them that really have gone back and examined Eisenhower and his leadership style. And as I was telling Joy Murphy before we went on air, a colleague of mine here at the college actually put together a course last year. It's all focused on Eisenhower and his leadership, and it uses his granddaughter's excellent work, How Ike Led. So, any rate, on to the next slide, if we could. All right, what I'd like to do here is just get us in the right mental frame to think about the summer and fall of 1956. It's really not that long after World War II, right? They were still very close to the events of World War II. It was only about 11 or 12 years since the war ended. And if you look at the left-hand side of this slide, you see at the top left, Cologne, Germany, utterly destroyed, save the cathedral. And at the bottom, you see Tokyo in 1945. Those are just city blocks of nothing, of rubble, just completely destroyed urban area. And just to the right of that, you see the mushroom cloud from the bombing of Hiroshima. Now, I wanted to highlight the fact that as terrible as the Hiroshima bomb was and the Nagasaki bomb was, and they were awesome and devastating, they didn't really breach any new level of destruction in World War II. In fact, if you look at the picture of Tokyo next to the mushroom cloud, the first time I saw that picture was when I was looking for photographs of Hiroshima after the bombing. And this picture came up on the internet. So you have to be careful about what you find on the internet, right? And then later I was looking for photographs of Nagasaki, and I found the same picture as being evidence of the destruction wrought by the atomic bombing of Nagasaki. And so I had to do some research to figure out if it was Hiroshima or Nagasaki, and it turns out what you're looking at is the Sumida River that runs through Tokyo, and that was after the firebombing of Tokyo in May of 1945, several months before the atomic bomb was dropped. So I wanted to highlight the fact that as awesome as the atomic bombs of World War II were, they're not nearly as powerful as the bombs we're going to talk about in a minute. And that had an effect on Eisenhower, I would argue. All right, moving along to the right, if you look across the bottom of the slide, you see President Truman and President Eisenhower and when their terms ran. And you see also the creation of the United Nations there at the bottom in October of 1945. Above that, you see the Marshall Plan. And this is really the start of the Cold War. Between the Marshall Plan, you see it at the top, just left of center, and below that, the Berlin airlift, is really sort of the firing or the opening shots being fired in the Cold War. The Berlin airlift ran from 48 to 49. And in there, you had Israel recognized as a state in May of 1948. And before the Berlin airlift ended, we had the creation of NATO. Before 1949 was over, two other very important historical events happened. One was that the Soviets detonated their first atomic bomb in August of 1949. And Mao and the communists managed to take control of China in October of 1949. So any one of these things would be a huge historical turning point, and they're all piled into this decade leading up to Suez. We had the Korean War kickoff in 1950. While that was going on, Britain joined the nuclear club with its first atomic bomb detonation. And then in March of 1954, as a result of the super, right, a thermonuclear weapon using fusion as well as fission. And this wasn't exactly the first test, but it was the first test of a weaponizable system or device. And it's still to this date the most powerful explosion that the United States has set off at 15 megatons. Now, it's really hard to get your brain around this. I won't try to go into a lot of detail, but maybe if we think about it in these terms, that is 1,000 times more powerful than the atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Okay, it's not 10 times more powerful, not 100 times more, 1,000 times more powerful. All right. Within days of that being dropped, Joseph Stalin died. I don't think it was as a result of finding out about our test, but at any rate, he departed the scene, and before long, the Korean War ended with Eisenhower in the White House, having campaigned on a pledge to end the war in Korea, to go to Korea and then to end the war in Korea, both of which he did. You'll see there in 1955, the formation of the Warsaw Pact there at the top between the pictures of those different explosions. And while it took the Soviet Union 5 years to catch up to us in terms of fission weapons, it only took them a little over 2.5 years before they detonated their first thermonuclear device. So by the end of 1955, both the United States and the Soviet Union have true city-busting, if you will, weapons. Right? There's no defense against these weapons. If you're in the vicinity of one of these things going off, it's game over. And then finally at the bottom there, you see Khrushchev with sort of a red and a big bracket. He managed to consolidate control over the Communist Party pretty quickly, but it was a long time before he declared himself premier. So he didn't have anything close to Stalin's power. So as we head into the Suez Crisis, it's important to realize that Khrushchev was more of a first among equals, or at least among some other contenders or people with a voice, unlike his predecessor, Stalin. He's still working on consolidating power. So that's all backdrop to the very eventful year of 1956. So if we could go to the next slide, please. And we've all heard about, or maybe some of us can remember and participated in air raid drills, or familiar with civil defense and civil defense exercises. But I suspect that most of the people in the audience today, whether online or in person, really have very little experience and no memory of what 1956 was like and what the Cold War was like. It's history to them, right? It's something you read about in a book. And it's hard to get the sense for what it was really like, how psychologically stressful it was to live with this idea that you could be obliterated, and there's really not a lot you could do about it. So what I'd like to highlight here, we just talked about the fact that the Soviets had tested a thermonuclear weapon. And I think that changed everything. Now, back then, there were no missiles, right? So they weren't going to get here in 30 minutes like in the missile age. Sputnik is still a year into the future after the Suez Crisis. So it really came down to delivering these things by bombers. And there was supposedly a bomber gap in which the U.S. was gravely inferior to the Soviet Union in terms of the number of bombers available to deliver these horrendous weapons. And across the bottom of this picture, what you see are a couple of civil defense posters and then 3 book covers. And I show these because they're very relevant to the summer of 1956. In the middle, you see Eyes in the Sky, and that's a book about the U-2. Eisenhower gave permission or approval for the first U-2 flights over the Soviet Union to try to find out if the bomber gap was real. And we'll come back to that later. But he was being pushed very hard to take risk and to fly this thing over the Soviet Union. by the people at the CIA who had developed this plan. And then to the left of that, you see this book, Raven Rock. And that's the one I really want to draw your attention to. I believe that the advent of thermonuclear weapons really changed Eisenhower. If you go back to 1953, you can find quotes of Eisenhower saying that we need to use nuclear weapons just like we would any other weapon. I don't think I've ever seen where he said the same thing about thermonuclear weapons. It really seemed to strike him deep in his core that kind of thinking was no longer possible. And so Raven Rock is a story about what the U.S. government did to try to ensure that if there were a nuclear war, that we would survive as a country. And it's got lots of great details, lots of great history. But important for us today is the fact that starting in 1955, the summer of 1955, we did these annual exercise or Operation Alert exercises. So Operation Alert, they call them OPAL exercises sometimes for short. But these started in 1955 and didn't go well, as you could imagine, right? So what's happening? The whole government is trying to pick up and move someplace else outside of the Washington, D.C. area where they can be safe. And some of you may be familiar with some of the sites around the country, around the DC area where folks went. There's Mount Weather, where much of the federal government would relocate to in Western Virginia. There was Site R up in Pennsylvania. There is a lovely Greenbrier Hotel just across the West Virginia state line. And in the basement of that, there was a nuclear bunker. Right? These things were all built in the 1950s. And at any rate, in 1956, which is what we're interested in, they held the second ever one of these Operation Alert exercises. And both the 1955 one and the 1956 one were complete fiascos, right? As you can imagine, as it dawned on the spouses of government officials that the government officials were going off to be saved and to carry on, leaving behind their families. Well, that didn't sit well with the spouses or with the government officials. Some of them flat out refused. If there wasn't going to be room for their spouse, that they weren't going to go either. The very first one, President Eisenhower surprised his staff and everybody by saying, okay, right, I'm going to sign a mock executive order declaring martial law. They had to go back to the days of Abraham Lincoln to see a precedent and what to do about that. And so in 56, President Eisenhower is trying to get up to the Camp David area, and his limousine gets stuck behind farm equipment on the way up there. So that's he gets there after all of his staff and other executive department members who helicoptered up. The Secret Service didn't want the president on a helicopter or in a single engine airplane. That changed after 1956 as a result of this Operation Alert exercise. I hope that gives you just a small flavor for how seriously our government took the threat of nuclear war and what it would mean for our country, right? Could we even survive? It was really, I think, an open question. All right, with all that, I think we're ready now to talk about 1956. So if we can go to the next slide. This was an astounding year. On the 25th of February, Khrushchev gave a secret speech to the 20th Party Congress of the Soviet Communist Party, in which he completely denounced Stalin. This was unheard of. This shook the communist world, right? And it eventually was largely a factor in the split between Mao and China and the Soviet Union, but that didn't develop fully for a few years. But it has secret in quotes there because Khrushchev, while he gave this speech in secret, he made sure that it got out. And it had a very big impact on the Warsaw Pact. That is the alliance structure opposing NATO. I mean, some of the satellite countries thought, wow, this is great. We're moving in a new direction here, maybe with less control from Moscow. In June of that year, in Poland, industrial workers rioted, and the Soviets had to go in and put that down. Later, well, before we get to the U-2 flights, you see there that in June, 7th of June, President Eisenhower had a ileitis attack, and that left him either in the hospital or at least out of Washington, up in Gettysburg, recuperating all the way through to the 16th of July. And that's really important because one of the first things he did when he came back to Washington after the ileitis was to have a meeting with John Foster Dulles and tell Dulles he could handle the situation with Egypt. And unfortunately, his Secretary of State, Eisenhower's Secretary of State, undiplomatically told the Egyptians that they weren't going to get any U.S. funds to build this Aswan High Dam. We had first offered those funds even after the Egyptians had made a bargain, a deal to buy Eastern Bloc arms. They're going to buy arms from the Czech Republic. And in fact, I think in an attempt to woo them away from the Soviets and the East Bloc, the U.S. and Britain offered to fund the Aswan High Dam. Well, in July, Secretary Dulles told him that that money was not going to be forthcoming. All right. Also in July, we had the very first U-2 flights. And these flew over St. Petersburg and Moscow, and he took pictures of those cities. And some of those pictures that were taken showed Soviet fighters trying to climb up to intercept the U-2s. Now, it was believed by the president and others that the U-2 was going to fly so high that Soviet radar would not be able to detect it. Well, they were detected on their very first flights. And the Soviets were stuck in a way because they didn't want to admit their weakness in their inability to intercept the U-2s, but they didn't want them to continue. So they eventually, on the 10th of July, they protested the U-2 flights. But the important takeaway for us is that these U-2 flights, well, two things. First, the CIA didn't tell the president that their U-2 flights were being intercepted. He only found out later when the Soviets protested, probably not endearing the CIA to the president. But more importantly, the U-2 flights proved that there was a bomber gap. It's just that it went the other way. It was the United States that had the big advantage over the Soviet Union. But Eisenhower couldn't tell anybody that. He knew that. He could now with confidence push back on those who wanted to spend a lot of money building more US B-52s, but he couldn't really share that. As a result of that, that decision to not fund the Aswan High Dam, within a week, Nasser decided to nationalize the Suez Canal. And that just drove the British and the French crazy. The French didn't like Nasser because they were fighting their own war in Algeria, and they knew that Nasser was supporting the Algerian rebels. The British owned 44% of the Suez Canal Company, and something like 70% of the oil from the Middle East bound to Europe passed through that canal. And so the French and the British were spring-loaded to take a hard stand against Nasser and to use force. President Eisenhower did not hesitate. He sent Dulles to London. He penned a letter to British Prime Minister Anthony Eden telling him, look, you can't use force yet. We have to find a different way. And so that ultimately led to a couple of London conferences, the Suez Canal conferences at London. There was one in August and then another one in September. that sort of bracketed the Republican National Convention. So remember, this is an election year, 1956, and the Republican National Convention held out in San Francisco took place from the 20th to the 23rd of August. And at the convention, President Eisenhower gave a speech accepting the party's nomination. And the theme of the speech was principles over expediency. In other words, America needed to do the right thing. It needed to stand on principle and not give in to whatever seemed most expedient at the moment. And I think this plays into, as Joy Murphy mentioned at the beginning, the idea this month is Eisenhower's moral authority, right? You'll see this come up again and again. He really was a man of principle. It was also the 100th anniversary of the Republican Party. And so Eisenhower used that to play on some themes from Lincoln's time when the party was just getting started, and we'll see that in a bit. But the idea was the Republican Party is the party of the future, and if it's going to stand for another 100 years, it needs to do certain things. And again, we'll come back to those. All right, moving on quickly now. After the Second London Conference, what began, some people called it the worst week in Eisenhower's presidency. In the first chapter, or in one of the early chapters of the second volume of his memoirs, right, Waging Peace, he talks about 20 busy days, right? But whether it's a week or 20 days, this was an extremely busy period. He's in the home stretch of a re-election campaign, and he's got this crisis brewing in the Middle East, which he thinks he's solved. Although he continues through U-2 flights and photographic evidence, he continues to see evidence there's trouble, but he thinks that the British and the French are not going to do anything before the election. He thinks he's kind of got that under control. And then on the 24th of October, revolution breaks out in Hungary. And at first, the Soviets take a fairly soft stand on this. There are a lot of people killed on the 24th itself, but in the days that followed, it looked like the Soviets were not going to crack down hard. That is until Prime Minister Nagy declared Hungary to be neutral, that his country had withdrawn from the Warsaw Pact, and now it looks like, remember the riots in Poland previously, before even that, there were protests in Germany and that had to be put down violently by the Soviets. And so starting on the 4th of November, the Soviets come in and for the rest of that month just brutally crack down on the rebels, the uprising. And then on the 5th of November, Britain and France launch a ground invasion. Now I skipped over, I think, I didn't mention the 31st of October, Britain and France had actually started bombing in Egypt. But then their ground forces go in on the 5th of November. And so this is the day before the Americans go to the polls to decide whether or not to reelect President Eisenhower. So you can see he's got his hands full with Hungary, with Suez, and with his reelection. And it was on the night of the 5th or into the 6th that Nikita Khrushchev, speaking through the Soviet premier, Bucknam, starts issuing some not so very veiled threats about World War III. He actually uses that terminology in a letter to Eisenhower, and talks about firing rockets at the British and the French, with the implication being that these would be nuclear weapons. And so that's all on Eisenhower's plate as he heads into the election. But he's got a lot of leverage, which we'll talk about, and he's able to use that, bring that to bear to get Anthony Eden to agree to a ceasefire on election day. They had just gone in the day before. The French were extremely disappointed, but nonetheless, the president was able to, without using military force, get the British to back down. Next slide, please. All right, so if we look at the situation then, when the ceasefire was declared, we see that the Israelis have moved in and taken over pretty much all of the Sinai. And meanwhile, the French and the British have gotten control over the canal zone. They're not everywhere. They're not in complete control. I mean, the operation on the ground just began on the 5th. But the Egyptians are beaten. The Egyptian army is beaten. And while Eden has agreed to a ceasefire, he still has what he wanted, which is he's got French and British forces on the ground there, in a better position to control the Suez Canal than anybody else. It should be noted that one of the reasons that the British said that they were going into Suez was to protect the canal zone, protect traffic through the canal zone. Well, it turns out that Nasser and the Egyptians, when they took over the canal zone, the Egyptian pilots managed to keep things moving. And in fact, there was more traffic flowing through the canal during the time that Egypt was running the canal than the months before when the British were running it. So as a result of the attack, Nasser has sunk some ships now to block the canal. So it's completely the dishonesty, the pretense was exposed. I mean, from the very beginning. But when Britain went to war, it was still in a bad shape from World War II. It needed money. Remember, it gets nearly 70% of its oil coming up through the canal, and Eisenhower could see in advance that they're going to need oil, and they're going to need money, and we have leverage in that regard. And so Eisenhower refused to meet with Eden, even though Eden asked to have a summit. He refused to send any oil to Europe. He blocked an International Monetary Fund loan to the British, and he refused to support the pound sterling, which was in free fall, until the British agreed to remove their troops from Egyptian soil. And that didn't happen until the 3rd of December. Eden actually left the country, went on vacation in Jamaica or someplace in the Caribbean, and it was Macmillan running things back home in the UK that eventually worked through the cabinet and announced that they would, in fact, remove their forces. So that was all Eisenhower's doing or planning or thinking. All right, next slide, please. All right, so in the final 7 or 8 minutes here before we go to question and answers, I just wanted to highlight a couple of really, really good books on Eisenhower. One on the crisis, the Suez Crisis, the other just on Eisenhower himself. The Age of Eisenhower, I think, is a terrific book. And these are just examples of some of the more recent histories that completely overturn the unfair, uninformed, inaccurate histories from the early 1960s. The Eisenhower and the Suez Crisis of 1956 is really a case study in leadership. That's what it's all about. How did Eisenhower make the best use of his staff, his cabinet, his intelligence people, his military? And all throughout these books and others you can find based on unclassified, what have now been unclassified documents, you see things like in the bottom, if you can see, you've got Alan Dulles and Richard Bissell from the CIA. There was a lot of pressure on the president to fly the U-2 over the Soviet Union. And Eisenhower was really, really careful about how he used that. He had no problem pushing back on these loyal, but maybe a little too eager subordinates. It comes clear, too, throughout the telling of the story that Eisenhower was in charge of foreign policy, and Dulles was a loyal subordinate. It wasn't that Dulles was leading Eisenhower around and deciding U.S. foreign policy. It was definitely the president in charge. And then with the Joint Chiefs there, their response to the Suez Crisis was, we should let Israel go. It's going to be a fait accompli. They're going to quickly take Sinai and defeat the Egyptians, and we should back the British and the French because they're our NATO allies. And so we that's important to us, and so we should back them. And so Eisenhower overruled them all and did it his way. So next slide, please. So back to the idea of moral persuasion. I think you can see throughout the biographies of Eisenhower, his memoirs. Of course, he had a deep familiarity and abhorrence of war, right? Like any American, he also opposed colonialism or imperialism. And you see in his Chance for Peace speech after the death of Stalin, his understanding of what it really truly cost in terms of our quality of lives and our values to have to fund an enormous military. And going to war was even much more expensive than that sort of thing. So if we move on there to the speech he gave at the Republican National Convention on the 23rd of August, 1956, you've got some quotes from the speech. He finally, again, this is a speech about the party of the future and the 100th anniversary of the founding of the party, and says we have to be completely dedicated to peace. And I like this quote that I've highlighted here. We are in the era of the thermonuclear bomb that can obliterate cities and can be delivered across continents. With such weapons, war has become not just tragic, but preposterous. With such weapons, there can be no victory for anyone. Plainly, the objective now must be to see that such a war does not occur at all. All right? After the Israelis invaded Egypt, the president went on TV for a 15-minute speech that he gave to the American public. And then he said, there can be no peace without law. And there can be no law if we invoke one code of international conduct for those who oppose us and another for our friends. And so again, these are just all among the many examples of Eisenhower standing on principle and not doing what some of his advisors were telling him. And that goes for the last bullet on the slide too, which is there are several instances of Eisenhower telling people that, you know, hey, if I lose the election, you can feel sorry for whoever you want, but don't feel sorry for me. And he clearly cared less about the outcome of the election than in maintaining peace, and especially heading off anything that might head towards World War III. And let me just read to you a really brief excerpt from his memoir, Waging Peace. This is at a time when Hungary is in uprising, the Soviets are cracking down, and the Soviet Union is threatening World War III and threatening to attack Britain and France. He wrote, the Soviets, I went on, he's referring back to what he said at the time in his memoir, seeing their failure in the satellites, might be ready to undertake any wild adventure. They are as scared and furious as Hitler was in his last days. There's nothing more dangerous than a dictatorship in that frame of mind. So in Eisenhower's mind, in the days before the election, there really was a threat of nuclear war with the Soviet Union, a threat of slipping into a war that would eventually involve the United States fighting against the Soviet Union, and that would likely lead to nuclear war. Next slide, please. All right, these are some lessons for today. I think that any politician or statesman could contemplate, think about. We've forgotten since the end of the Cold War how to think about nuclear weapons and deterrence. And where I teach, we're working very hard at the direction of the Joint Chiefs of Staff to try to help our students, these rising national security professionals, to understand that how devastating nuclear weapons are and how to think about deterrence. It's, again, something we haven't done for about a quarter of a century. We also are reminded something that Thucydides wrote about a long time ago, and that our founders, our nation's founders, understood clearly because they read their Thucydides, which is that great powers can be drawn into war with one another through the actions of their allies, right? And so that's something that we see the risk of just pregnant in the whole Suez situation. Wars are very much expensive, and they can cause nations to fall. And in fact, the Suez Crisis was a real turning point, right? Britain and France were never the same after the Suez Crisis. They were already in decline, but that decline quickly accelerated. In all wars, it's the politics that's central, the political aim, not who wins the battles. Because the French, I mean, the Suez Crisis, the French and the British won their battles. They won militarily, but it was a debacle politically for them. Okay. World affairs are highly interconnected. It's really hard to divorce one part of the world from another or isolate it, wall it off, right? And we see that today as there's continued turmoil in the Middle East, and it does reverberate in how we act and deal with other situations. With all the current concern about climate change, I think we've lost sight of the concern for energy security. But the importance of energy security and sound national finances come across loud and clear in this case study. Eisenhower used non-military instruments, and so it's a great case study for understanding how to use diplomacy and economics. Politics does not stop at the water's edge. Adlai Stevenson's and his campaign were merciless in attacking Eisenhower politically during these crises. There was no rallying around the flag or uniting behind the president. And then lastly, the years in which America holds its presidential elections are very tempting for foreign opportunists, very tempting to take actions believing that any administration would be paralyzed. So we can go to the next slide. We'll wrap up. This is just from President Eisenhower's speech about the future of the party that he gave at the Republican National Convention in August of 1956, right? He quoted Lincoln quoting the Bible about a house divided. And the last segment there, it's sometimes forgotten, Lincoln followed this quotation with a note of hope for this troubled country. I do not expect the house to fall, he said, but I do expect it will cease to be divided. And I think if President Eisenhower were with us here today, that would still be his hope, both for our country to be less divided and for the world to be less divided. So let me stop there and we'll move on to questions and answers.
All right, thank you so much for that great presentation. We will be taking questions from the audience if we have any. And also there are some questions in the chat, so we'll start there. The first question says, what was the significance of the Suez Canal for international trade and global politicism in the mid-20th century?
Yeah, it was certainly central. If you one of the other interests I have is energy and energy security, and if you look at World Bank studies, economic development tracks in tandem with the use of energy. I mean, that's what makes today different from the pre-industrial era. We've replaced the energy of our muscles or animal power or windmills to some degree. We've replaced that with fossil fuels, with nuclear energy, with other forms of more modern energy. That completely underpins economics and our well-being and our standard of living, right? Europe was getting 70% of its energy, or nearly 70% of its the oil that it needed to run its economy for transportation from the Middle East. And so it was extremely important in that regard. As far as other sorts of trade, it was obviously important. The British no longer had India as part of their empire, so there wasn't that strategic concern that Britain had. but the trade that flowed between Europe and Asia without the canal is going to have to go all the way around Africa, the southern tip of Africa, right? Adding huge costs to transportation and that sort of thing. So it was quite important. But I should remind you, when Nasser seized the canal, President Eisenhower was not that concerned. I mean, he didn't like it, but he pointed out to the British and the French that this was not illegal, as long as Egypt justly compensated the stockholders of the Suez Canal Company. There was nothing wrong with him nationalizing it. Under international law, he could do that. As long as he maintained the flow of traffic through the canal. And in fact, flow of traffic went up under the Egyptian pilots. So there really wasn't it didn't appear there really wasn't a threat. Eden perceived it differently. He saw it as giving Nasser a thumb on the British jugular, right? That he could close it any time he wanted to. Yeah, it was an important trade route, but much more so for the British and for the Europeans than for America.
I do want to circle back to that, but first there's another question in the chat. It says, did President Eisenhower's intermittent poor health during this time impact his response to the crisis of the Suez Canal?
I don't think it did. I mean, it's other than the recuperation from ileitis that took him out of the picture in the early summer, but really most of the really problematic things came after that, and he was able to deal with them. Now, that's not to say that he was feeling great while he did it, but it didn't seem to stop him. A couple of the books I read on this suggest that he was, by one observer, he was talking to his doctor, Dr. Schneider, every couple of hours, right? Because he did have some high blood pressure, some episodes of high blood pressure, irregular heartbeat, and some discomfort from his abdominal surgery, the after effects of that. So those were plaguing him, troubling him during this time, but didn't seem to stop him from doing what he thought he needed to do.
We are having a little bit of audio concerns. However, we're going to try to power through. We're almost finished. So first I'll ask her, is there any questions in our in-person audience? From our in-person audience?
Good afternoon. My question is, you had said earlier that war is very expensive. And since France and England was already at war and their funds were being taken up by the war, who funded the Suez Canal? Did the U.S. do it by themselves?
I'm not sure exactly what you mean by that. Let me try to take a stab at an answer, but please come back at me if I missed the point. So the operating of the Suez Canal pays for itself, right? The shipping companies that use the canal paid fees, just like you and I would pay a toll on a toll road or to cross a bridge that had a toll, right? And so the canal was a money maker. So nobody had to fund the operation of the canal. It was self-funding. It was a money maker. But maybe I missed your question.
Your answer. My second question is that you stated that Israel, am I wrong, that Israel attacked Egypt? Is that correct?
Yes, that's right. So
this was only a few years after. I'm sorry.
Yeah, right.
This was only a few years after Israel became a country.
Right. So what happened? The history of that is that when Israel declared itself a country, the U.S. quickly recognized that, and Israel was immediately attacked by its neighbors. And so the first Arab-Israeli war began in May of 1948 with Israel becoming a country. This is often called the second Arab-Israeli war, that is the Suez War. Now, it doesn't mean there was peace in between time. The Gaza Strip was used by Palestinian entities who were not happy with Israel and wanted to make Israel pay for having taken area that they thought was theirs. And so there are these Fedayeen who attacked regularly out of the Gaza Strip and sometimes fled back across the Egyptian border into the Sinai. So Israel had and actually Nasser, the Egyptian president, actually wanted to kind of help Israel. He didn't want to go to war with Israel. He sort of didn't really want these Fedayeen using his territory to provoke Israel. But they did. They continued to, and Nasser really couldn't control them. And so it wasn't that Israel decided on its own to go attack Egypt. What happened was the British and the French went to Israel and put Israel up to this. The British and the French at a meeting in Sèvres, France, on the 22nd of October, I believe, like very close to the event. The fact that they tried to pull this off on such a short timeline is just mind-boggling. But they went to Israel and convinced Israel, listen, you attack, and then we'll use that as our excuse to come in and say, hey, we're just here to break up the fighters, those who are fighting. And and when we do that, then we'll have to keep the peace, and we'll establish our military presence there on the canal. So it wasn't like Israel was on its own going out to pick a fight with Egypt. And in fact, on the 1st of November, Israel agreed to a ceasefire, and Egypt tentatively agreed to the ceasefire. And yet it was still almost a week later. It was the 6th before Eisenhower pressured Eden enough to finally get the British to agree to a ceasefire. So the whole reason that they were going in there in the first place, to secure the canal and to keep the combatants apart and bring stability, was completely shown to be a lie from the get-go. But yeah, they were all, the Israelis were in cahoots with the British and the French. The British and the French put them up to it. It was the British and the French idea, and they used the Israelis to help execute their plan.
All right. So again, we continue to have some audio issues. So I'm actually going to go ahead and wrap us up right now. So first of all, let me say thank you again to Dr. Buckman for your wonderful presentation. And thank you to each and every one of you for joining us today. We do have a few closing announcements. You'll just bear with us. All right, our 2024 public programs are made possible by the Eisenhower Foundation and the Jeffcoat Memorial Foundation. We are certainly appreciative to both of these organizations, because without them, we would not be able to continue to provide these programs for you. And we would like to invite you back for next month for our next two programs, our Evenings at Ease, which will be sort of a mini version of a Project Solarium that Dr. Bucknam talked about earlier today. So we would love for you to join us for that. And then, of course, our Lunch and Learn, where we will welcome David Haight. If you'd like to learn more about our programs, you can join our email list. We are happy to get that information out to you. Thank you so much. I hope that you enjoyed our programming today, and have a wonderful afternoon.